In the heart of Italy stands one of the most famous and recognizable landmarks of all time in one of Europe's most famous and recognizable cities of all time, the Colosseum in Rome. In terms of Roman history, the Colosseum came into being a little later than some people might think. For example, many of Rome's most memorable and iconic historical figures, such as Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian, otherwise known as Augustus, as well as their well-known contemporaries, like Cleopatra, never lived to see the Colosseum, and even the person who commissioned the Colosseum in the first place never got to see it completed. Construction of the Colosseum began in 70 AD, at the beginning of Rome's second imperial dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. The building itself, a large amphitheater, was originally commissioned by Emperor Vespasian, the first of the three Flavians to rule as emperor in Rome, all three of whom would go on to contribute different parts to the Colosseum's final design. Just 10 years after it was initially commissioned, construction of the Colosseum was finally completed in 80 AD, and was inaugurated as the Flavian Amphitheater by Vespasian's oldest son and successor, Emperor Titus. The grand opening was marked by more than 100 days of celebrations, shows, games, and other events, all hosted at the largest amphitheater the world had ever seen. Among other things, the Colosseum is of course famous for having hosted gladiatorial battles, where trained combatants, or gladiators, were equipped with various weapons, armor, and even at times somewhat gimmicky tools, and made to compete with each other in hand-to-hand combat. These fights weren't typically fought to the death, as gladiators, albeit mostly slaves and criminals, were often trained professionals whose training and preparation required a lot of time, money, and resources, and naturally their managers, with whom they held contracts, or sometimes just belonged to as slaves, didn't want their investments to go to waste, so it was common for one of the participants to submit rather than keep the fight going until the bitter end. That is, if the crowd or other outside influences didn't say otherwise. It wasn't just trained professionals who competed though, as there were many participants who were forced to compete in gladiatorial matches with little or even no prior combat experience at all. These were typically prisoners who had been handed death sentences, and war captives from various Roman conquests who were forced to compete for everyone's entertainment, regardless of their ability to fight effectively or not. They usually died. Besides gladiatorial battles, the Colosseum also hosted a range of other public events and shows, such as exotic animal hunts, theatrical and other artistic performances, public executions of prisoners, yes, just straight-up executions sometimes, and probably most impressively, full-stage reenactments of real historical battles fought between the Romans and their enemies in various wars. The most intense of these reenactments and mock battles had to have been the mock naval battles, which, for a short time, were also staged within the confines of the Colosseum, for instance, during the processions of its inauguration. During such events, the floor of the Colosseum was completely flooded with water so that specially constructed ships with flat hulls or bottoms could float and maneuver freely on the arena floor as if they were at sea. Although some historians contest whether or not this was actually at all possible, or that the ships, for instance, might have just been props that stood in one place the entire time. But regardless, what isn't contested is that groups of gladiators, mostly prisoners sentenced to death, would board each other's ships and fight in an all-out brawl between different teams until one group was left standing. These mock sea battles, or naumachii as they were called in Latin, were much more dangerous and bloodier than typical gladiatorial battles. However, due to their extreme costs, and more importantly, the addition of the hypogeum under the arena floor around 90 AD, the naumachii ceased to be held inside the Colosseum. The last instance of a naumachia being organized in the Colosseum itself came in 89 AD, under Emperor Domitian. Domitian, who was the younger son of Vespasian, and the last of the three Flavians to rule as emperor, was also the one who commissioned the amphitheater's aforementioned hypogeum, the substructure beneath the Colosseum floor that consisted of various passageways, rooms, and cells for holding various animals, such as lions, tigers, and bears, until showtime, which usually meant either an animal hunt or execution of a prisoner by damnatio ad bestias, damnation or condemnation de beasts. In other words, execution by a deadly wild animal. During such events, trapdoors inside the stadium floor were opened up while workers used a series of ramps and lifts to transport the animals from their cells in the hypogeum to the arena floor, revealing them to the crowds. As you can imagine, the existence of this subterranean complex made flooding the above floor of the Colosseum in preparation for mock sea battles impossible. Together with a fourth floor of seats intended for poor spectators and slaves that was added around 82 AD, also by Domitian, the hypogeum was one of the last major changes made to the Colosseum by a Flavian. And speaking of the Flavians, I mentioned earlier how the original name of the Colosseum was the Flavian Amphitheater. So why do we just call it the Colosseum today? Well, it actually has to do with another major monument that came about shortly before the Colosseum. That monument was the Colossus of Nero, a 100 to 120 foot tall bronze statue commissioned by the Emperor Nero likely in the year 64 AD and completed sometime after his death in 68 AD, perhaps during Vespasian's rule from 69 to 79 AD. Not only are we unsure about the exact timeline of its construction and proportions, but it's also unclear what or whom the statue was made to represent. We have records from ancient historians that state that the statue resembled Nero himself, as if it were just a large monument built by Nero dedicated to himself as emperor. But other accounts mention that the statue was instead built in the image of the Roman sun god Sol, sort of like a Roman counterpart to the Greek god Helios. A third variation is that the statue was originally intended to be built in the image of Nero, or Nero dressed in the insignia of Sol, but was later altered to resemble just the sun god after Nero's death, which is when his legacy and image fell victim to something called damnatio memoriae, damnation or condemnation of memory. Basically, the Romans didn't like what Nero had done as emperor, and so they collectively decided to shun his legacy after his death. Whatever the case, we know for sure that the Colossus of Nero existed and that it stood in tandem with the Colosseum as an unmistakable part of ancient Rome's skyline for hundreds of years before it collapsed sometime in the 4th to 5th centuries AD. And despite the fact that it's been gone for well over 1,000 years by now, we still know the very spot where it once stood, thanks to a few stone blocks that once served as part of the statue's foundation all those years ago. There's also a marble plaque and a small group of cypress trees that let people know where the Colossus once stood. And although the Colossus couldn't withstand the test of time like the Colosseum has managed to, it was still around long enough to leave such a mark on the Roman capital that medieval historians years later began to refer to the Flavian amphitheater as the Colosseum. The last recorded use of the Colosseum was a series of animal hunts in 523 AD, after which it fell into a state of disuse and disrepair. Since then, a combination of natural disasters, pollution, lack of maintenance, as well as chronic pillaging and vandalism have all contributed to the state it's found in today, which is quite different from when it was first built. In addition to half of the entire outer wall that's missing, much of the original seating inside is gone as well, especially the marble seats that once lined the bottom rows of seating designated for Rome's senators and other aristocrats. Not only that, but much of the travertine limestone that made up the sturdier foundations of the Colosseum was quarried and carted off by Rome's citizens over the years for use in other construction projects, both personal and public works. And perhaps most strangely of all, the metal pins and clamps that held together many of the larger stone blocks all throughout the Colosseum's foundation were often dug out to be melted down, recast, and reused in other projects as well. This is actually why the Colosseum today is dotted everywhere with holes. It's where the pins and clamps used to be before they were extracted. Suffice to say, the Colosseum has suffered quite a bit over the years, but yet it still stands. Recently, there have been many ideas of various restoration projects suggested for the Colosseum, some of which have been carried out or are ongoing right now as we speak. This includes a general cleanup of the amphitheater's outer walls and sealing some of the surface level cracks in the travertine limestone. Other, more ambitious ideas, such as a complete restoration of the arena's original wooden floor, have also been floated around, but as of now, there are no plans to implement such a restoration. Exactly to what extent or how Italy's most visited and likely most well-known monument will be restored is unclear. But one thing's for sure, no matter what happens, it will never compare to the original state of this grand amphitheater's architectural presence and ability to entertain the masses like at the time of its inauguration and throughout its heyday in the early centuries AD. And maybe that's not such a bad thing, since forcing poor, underprivileged people, prisoners, war captives, and wild animals to fight and kill each other for other people's amusement, as well as making a spectacle out of publicly executing political and religious prisoners with the most brutal means possible, isn't exactly the paragon of ethics. Still a cool building though.